Reading the Bible is the most normal and natural Christian discipline, something that practically every believer can do, or so it would seem. But in 1551, something happened that dramatically changed how we read the Bible. Verse divisions. This new technology solved a problem that many were not even aware existed. And on that front, verse divisions were an invaluable improvement. However, they also introduced a problem that has become so ingrained and universal that we are now just as oblivious to this problem that verse divisions have introduced as the first 1,500 years of Christians were to the problem that verse divisions solved. At the risk of oversimplification, in 1551, the universal practice of proof texting was born. Doctrinal debates quickly became reference fights, and doctrinal teaching was reduced to cross-reference marathons. However, the problem that I'm speaking of is not even those. The principal casualty of the innovation of verse divisions was the healthy appreciation of the common literary character of the Scriptures. The text has now been arbitrarily sectioned into approximately equal-sized chunks, kind of like a sushi chef slices up a spicy tuna roll. And even worse, what was intended to facilitate comparison, sharing, and quick lookup has become a form of pseudo-inspiration. Some teachers even going so far as to discover supernatural meaning in the verse numbers themselves. The seventh word of the seventh verse of the seventh chapter. It's not an exaggeration to say that many, perhaps most, Christians do not know that the grammatical structure of paragraphs and sentences and clauses has no correlation to the verse and chapter divisions of their Bibles. They assume that the Bible was written this way, and that these chapters and verses are the natural divisions of the text. However, it isn't true that they have consciously thought this through and arrived at this conclusion. Rather, they have been conditioned by the education system their entire life to read this way. In most Bibles, every verse is a paragraph. It is capitalized and it ends with a carriage return, and it's numbered to boot, all regardless of how the preceding verse ended. Many of you will be stunned to realize that most verses are not full sentences, and that many of the sentences in the Scriptures span substantial portions of the chapters. For instance, Ephesians chapter 1 comprises 3 sentences, a short salutation of verses 1 and 2, followed by 2 long, complex sentences spanning the remaining 21 verses. And these aren't even the longest sentences in the New Testament. So why does this matter? Well, what would you think if someone were to arbitrarily extract 4 words out of the middle of a 100-word sentence that you wrote and formulate an entire body of opinion on what you said? Perhaps you would consider that to be taking you out of context. And in which way is that not blatant eisegesis? How many sermons and Sunday school lessons are conceived from having something to say and then go and look for a verse or phrase, or at the very least 3 words that say that, or something like that, or something that can be made to say something like that, or whatever? An example of this approach would be to take the phrase, "Who shall prepare himself to the battle?" and conjure an exhortational sermon discussing the types of Christians who prepare themselves for battle, or an inspirational sermon exhorting Christians to prepare themselves for battle, or an admonishing sermon warning Christians of the battle to come and the need to be prepared, none of which has anything at all to do with what the Apostle Paul was saying when he wrote 1 Corinthians. I suppose these would be good preaching, but they are terrible exegesis. The result of this approach to the Scriptures is that it devalues them down to an excuse to say something, while at the same time elevating them to a fantastically serendipitous collection of random words that can be tokenized into any configuration of arbitrary phrases that can have any and all meaning that those words can possibly absorb, even anachronistically. Sadly, too often this is what passes for inspiration, and it denigrates real inspiration into looking like something insipid or ordinary. That is to say that this is to inspiration what reality TV is to reality. What is so sad about all of this is we are pushing aside what the brilliant, dedicated authors worked so hard and sacrificed so much to communicate. And for what? To promote our own message and views? Who cares what Paul's deep concerns and heartfelt prayers in Ephesians were all about when we have so many better things to say? And why let the single-minded freight train admonition of Hebrews get in the way of a good sermon that has nothing to do with the context? And while we're at it, let's just brush aside the sophisticated brilliance of 1 John to make way for limp, shallow proof texting. I do get it. In part, we want the Bible to have something to say about everything, an answer for every problem. And, in part, we want to appropriate credibility for our own message. I know it might sound harsh to put it that way, but too often it isn't anything more than that. It's the less than noble ambition to legitimize our own thoughts and words by scripturizing them. In other words, the two-edged practice of molding our vocabulary to mirror a text while at the same time carving that text to fit our intent. I think that it is legitimate, perfectly legitimate, to speak from our heart. In other words, to address issues with nothing more than the wisdom that we have through God's Spirit and the gift of discernment in our experience. But why pretend that what we have to say is spelled out in the Bible? It can be true without being Bible. However, if we want our sermon to be Bible, then it must be derived from the obvious literary meaning of the full context. This is why Christians need to go back to reading the Bible as literature. What does that mean? First, get a Bible that doesn't have verse divisions. It used to be difficult to find one. I know. I searched for a long time before I finally came across one back in the old days. But today it's easy. Quite a few Bible apps and Bible websites have reader's editions that display the text in paragraph format and will even remove the verse numbers altogether. Freeborn Church even provides the New Testament in individual plain text files on our website, freebornchurch.com. And you can download those and open them in practically any text editor or viewer on almost any device. It would seem simple to just look past the verse numbers and divisions, but it's harder to do than you might imagine. I've tried. I find it far easier and more profitable to avail myself of my education system training in reading and comprehension rather than work against it. Besides, if it were that simple, then why do so few people even know what the overall point of these books are after they've read them dozens of times? Second, stop trying to proof text doctrines. The Bible is not written as a topical concordance. It is written mostly as highly contextual personal letters or historical records in narrative form. It's full of figures of speech, metaphors, and models, and those are intended to be interpreted within the limited scope and context of the text itself. Word studies spanning multiple books, even books by the same author, are of very little use. Some are of no use at all. Even books that reuse many of the same literary elements, such as Colossians and Ephesians do, have very little in common as it pertains to their main point and objective. And therefore, those common elements are used in entirely different ways and should sit on their own contextual base. And third, read to comprehend what the point of the book is. Everyone talks about the context, but the overall point of the book is the context, not the surrounding verses, because there were no verses until 1,500 years after the book was written. What point What single, overarching point was Paul trying to communicate in Ephesians? What is the point of 1 John? What is the point of Hebrews? Do they have a point? If they do, then everything in them must be interpreted in that light, because those things are merely means and methods for communicating the central point. Taking them as independent, universal, limitless truths is to take them out of context. The Bible is an amazing compilation of brilliant writings. It doesn't need to be mythologized into magical fortune cookie fragments. Modern preaching that reduces it to that is vulgar, short-sighted, and is too often self-serving. The apostles and prophets did not address every possible issue and scenario, but what they did address, they did so with aplomb, and we shouldn't dismember it in order to Frankenstein together our own opinions.
So be free.